welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's me, Jackie.
And it's me, Diana.
Well, welcome, everybody. Here we are talking all about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research. And every week, we have a topic relevant to the field. And you might notice that we didn't try to do a funny story because, while I think our episode today will certainly have a lot of the fun and whimsy we like to bring to these topics, I also could not think of any sort of fun story that I thought would not come off as really crass and callous to the topic, which is going to be applications of trauma-informed care. Now, many of you might say, trauma-informed care, I've heard a lot about that, but it seems like it's brand new. Only recently have we started talking about it. And I guess, yeah, maybe in our field, it's a little bit more recent. So we are very excited to have someone who's been working in the field and thinking and practicing trauma-informed care for a long time now, and that is Saundra Bishop. Saundra, thank you so much for joining us today to talk all about trauma-informed care, and specifically its application in behavior analytic work.
I'm super excited to be here. I am a big fan of this podcast. I am fangirling myself being here right now. So thank you so much for having me.
We're so excited to have you.
Yes, it's and we appreciate. Well, it's always nice to start off a conversation with such positive intentions, especially for a topic that is, I think, can be very, very intense, can be very sad. And I'm so glad that we have people in our field that have been thinking about these questions for more than what seems like, you get an article, and we'll talk about some of the recent articles in our field. They feel like maybe it's only 6 months old. Like, this is the first time anyone's mentioned trauma, for a BCBA. And so it's great to have someone who has the experience that you bring to this topic, who's already been doing a lot of the legwork in terms of the application. So we'll be talking all about that work, as well as some background articles. But before we get into our conversation, why don't we share the articles that we'll be discussing, and then We'll get into it. So, Diana, take us away. What will we be talking about today?
Okay, so we have several different articles that we're going to review for today, and they come from, again, sort of a variety of backgrounds as far as the resources go. So one of them is Preventing Adverse Childhood Experiences, Leveraging the Best Available Evidence, and that was put out by the CDC in 2019. We also have The 3 Pillars of Trauma-Informed Care. That is by Bath, 2008, published in Reclaiming Children and Youth. And then we have Toward Trauma-Informed Applications of Behavior Analysis by Rajaraman, Austin, Gover, Cammilleri, Donnelly, and Hanley. That was JABA 2021, which we've reviewed not long ago, but it'll be part of this discussion as well. And then finally, we have the Trauma-Informed Behavior Management Handbook. That was put out by Sandra, and it is through Basics ABA Therapy LLC.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And while you're talking, I did think of a segue I could have used to start that wouldn't have been that bad. I feel bad. This the listeners, they come for my segues.
We can do. I
want to hear it. You have to share it.
They don't though, Rob. Just so you know, they don't come.
What? I'm pretty sure. Has anyone emailed specifically saying, I like your podcast, I hate those intro segues?
Yes. No. I'm just kidding.
No one's ever said that. Okay, then that would be the trauma-informed. No. So, because I was just thinking, we're having some work done on the house, and so people might hear some hammering in the background, but part of it has been they took away all the gutters, and they took away, like some of the siding, because they're doing some work. And the other night it rained suddenly. They weren't expecting it. We got rain just dripping through our windows, and it was terrifying. And Diana is like half asleep and doesn't care. But for me, I remember one time I came down in our basement. Everyone was away except for me. And it was like our garage was flooded. And it was the scariest thing I'd ever seen, because it was one of those adult problems that you're like, I know there must be a solution to this, but I don't know what it is because I don't understand plumbing or weather or fixing anything. And it was very traumatic. So I was getting flashbacks with our leaky windows the other night. And Diana is very annoyed with my constant checking how our windows are going. And
it was 2 a.m.
It was very late in the morning. But, I think that does, I didn't mean it to be like a funny segue or to make trauma sound like some sort of goofy thing that can happen. it is odd when you think about, or it is something worth thinking about, that these different events that to some people, like, that's just some stupid life event that happens, can have these really strong kind of this emotional valence to them. Like I almost froze just seeing water in my, like, I didn't know how to handle that. It scared me because I'd had this previous experience. So that was kind of my segue. Not that exciting, but I was just going to tell a boring story about my stupid leaky house and how it felt somewhat traumatic to me. And not in the sense of, I think, certainly the same level of intensity or importance as, say, for a child or for a youth, but, just how. So I think some of, when as I learn more about trauma-informed care, how much of it is just that assumption of, like, so many things happen in our lives, and to just assume, well, for me, who cares, is not a good way to approach this topic, because what is traumatic is not going to be, it's not like a list. It's not like, here are the 5 traumatic things that could happen. If it's not those, don't worry about it. Just barge ahead with business as usual.
So, and I think, though, that, like, I hear you kind of backtracking on whether or not that was a reasonable story to tell. But I think that the idea being, though, right, that was an event and you had a learning history associated with it, right? And that it's not a, trauma Olympics, and that there's not like a more trauma or a less trauma. And I think that that's why, when I talk about this, I don't use the word traumatic. I use the word trauma event, right? And you define that based off of, we look at it as a setting event, right? So you had water come through your house, right? And then what was the effect there? Then what was your ABC after that, right? You had water come through your house, right? That happened to you. And then it cost you a bunch of money. You had financial hardship. It was really stressful. You couldn't use your basement, all of these things, right? And that has a real effect to it as a grown up. And so then when we look at this in the future, how that affects you. And yeah, it didn't paralyze you for long periods of time, but that still brings back that learning history. Mm-hmm. And so it can be large scale, it can be small scale, and it can be for a second, and we can giggle and think about it as being real, silly and just close our windows, or it can have a intense long-term effect on us. And so I do think it's a good example, and one that's not highly emotionally charged, it sounds like, but I think it is a good example.
Oh, thank you. I feel very validated. Thank you, Sandra. What a good way to start a show. It's all gone. Oh,
it's over. We're done. I can leave now.
So, we just do this podcast for the free therapy sessions, I guess. So, Sandra, before I start going off into some other problems I'm having, why don't you tell us and our audience all about you and your background and how you came to the area of trauma-informed care as being, a real cornerstone of your practice?
I am the CEO and clinical director of Basics ABA Therapy, which I started 13 years ago. I had a baby and I wanted to have the flexibility of having my own company. And, it was something I talk about a lot, is that I'm in this interesting cohort of BCBAs because I've been a BCBA for 13 years. And APBA did this like state of ABA right before COVID happened, where they said that 2/3 of BCBAs had been certified in the last 3 years.
Yeah.
And that's really powerful about how young our field is.
Yes.
Right. And I suspect those numbers are relatively similar now.
And more so.
Yeah. And so you've got the BCBAs who've been here for 30 years, who help, shape the field, and then all these young BCBAs. And then there's like my little cohort of BCBAs who've been BCBAs for 15 to 10 years. And we were trained. Yeah. Right. And so we got a thumbs up here. We were trained by BCBAs who did more traditional ABA. Yes. And a lot of us have decided to do things differently. And so that happened to me, and I had a baby. And so I had my daughter, and I realized that I didn't want to leave her to cry. Right. And then I realized that, I didn't want to have my clients leave them to cry either. Mm-hmm. And I had like a crisis, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, am I ruining children's lives? How can I like do this differently? And so we immediately transitioned the field then, or our practice then, to do a more gentler approach. And then 2 years later, I became a foster parent. And at that point, I learned about trauma systems. Mm-hmm. And then that was another huge transition.
Yeah.
Where, I learned about how to, trauma really affects the brain and parenting. And, I tell a story about how, and again, this breaks it down into very basic terms, but in trauma systems, if a kid throws a shoe at you, you're supposed to love on them, right? If a kid throws a shoe at you, you determine the function, but right, you either ignore them or you hug them, you either ignore them or you follow through with your direction.
Right. Yeah.
And both of them work often, given the situation. But if you ignore them in ABA, you're going to re-traumatize the kid who is, acting out because they've suffered severe neglect. And so, but I also saw foster parents who kept having shoes thrown at them or who were disrupting placements because they were told that they couldn't discipline kids or were interpreting that they couldn't discipline kids. And so I knew that there had to be a way to bridge these gaps. And so I developed the model I'm working on now, which looks at the trauma events as a setting event or an MO and the behavior chain. But yeah, so I do webinars, I do trainings, I wrote this handbook. I'm the president of DCABA. And yeah, that's who I am.
Excellent. And I do appreciate that, all that thought you put into this. Certainly, we'll get into the handbook too, Sandra, but that idea of trauma-informed care, the child throws the shoe and what's our go-to? And of course, it's probably going to be, you remind them of rules or they have timeout. And is that the worst thing that you could do? Not in technical terms, but it could be for that child. But then that other idea of just saying, hey, we got to be trauma-informed, so let's just make sure we have lots of hugs available. That is very important in terms of when we're going to talk, talking about like pillars of care. But is that going to solve every problem? And the answer is not necessarily, because there's more to it than just, if only everyone hugged more, we'd be a happier place, which might also be true, but isn't necessarily the full picture solution to every problem a family or a child who has a learning history.
In Trollville, right? Where they have the watches that tell you hug time.
When it's hug time. But that didn't help. That didn't help Troll Branch. He was still very he was traumatized because the troll ate his grandma or whatever.
He was. You're right.
So
that strategy didn't work for him.
No, just hugging annoyed him. It actually didn't help him.
The setting events for him.
Oh, I
might cry now.
I'm not going to cry about trolls.
Well, wait until you start thinking about like Encanto, then you're really going.
Right? Oh, yes.
Oh, okay, yeah. That was a bit more. That was.
I don't know why Disney always has to make Disney and any children programming have to make the most horrific events happen in these movies. And then you have to explain them to your children if they understand it. Or you have to explain to your children why you are like bawling your eyes out and have to go to the bathroom.
Oh, I found if you tell them ahead of time that something is really scary or traumatic, because I watched all the Disney movies with my youngest, and I said, oh, here's Pinocchio, the scene where the kid turns into a donkey. It's awful. It's terrifying. Like, imagine what that would be like to be yanked from your family. And he didn't bat an eye. Like, I'm freaking out. I'm like, I don't think I can watch this movie anymore. And he'll make fun of me about it. And he's almost 7.
A safe and secure environment,
I guess. And he's like, oh, let's watch Pinocchio, Dad. Ooh, because he knows it'll make me upset, which is just great.
So something, though, that is actually really interesting, though, is that some of these movies can be triggering. They can be trauma event setting events or they can be setting events, trauma triggers. Common Sense Media actually is really good at summarizing those potential triggers. Like, I think people often use them to see, like, if they show, like, boobies or something.
Yeah. One of the scales. How many?
They tell you how many breasts are going to be in the movie. So it's very important. But the thing that they often have a very good summary to be like, if there's parent loss, if there's things like that, like Kung Fu Panda, right? Mm-hmm. We almost walked into that And that deals with significant parental loss and foster care and adoption. And so having those models can be great, but also having access to that information before going into it is very useful.
Yeah. It's a great website.
Yeah.
Resource.
Because I have 4 kids, 3 of which I've adopted from foster care.
Just 4. We have 3, but 4 feels like it's gone too many. 3 felt like too many. 4, bless you.
People were like, oh, once you get to 3, anything more is just the same. I was like, no. 4 is definitely more than 3.
It is weird. We have a lot of listeners who are younger and might not have children, but your children aren't just a little you, and they're all exactly the same. They're very different, small individuals that require a lot of time and care.
I was really, really a good parent when I had 1 kid, and I knew everything, and all of my parenting philosophies were correct. And then my second child came, and I realized that had nothing to do with the personality of my young kids or my oldest. And the next kid is the most incredible child in the whole world, who also has nothing to do with my parenting, but is a very, very different child.
I know.
I think a lot of BCBAs I've heard give similar stories as well, which is they were trained one way and then they become parents, and suddenly everything that they were trained in no longer makes as much sense to them, right? Because they have an emotional attachment, of course, to their children, and all the emotions are just so much more heightened, right? So I think it makes you a more empathetic practitioner toward the parents that we work with and the kids that we work with as well, which sounds like part of your initial experience and how you wanted to change your approach to practice.
I know that you're not saying, Diana, that people have to have kids to be a good clinician too, and I do want to make that point out, right?
Right. Sorry. Did not mean to.
I don't think
make it sound like that.
Yeah, I just want to. I think you were saying that you do. It does help, but I don't think you need to have kids to have that empathy. But it does bring
or that epiphany. I feel like a lot of people after they have kids then suddenly say, "This feels different to me," right? And you're right. You wouldn't have to have kids to have that realization.
Yeah, just want to make sure we put that out there.
Okay.
You might have a different realization.
Let's let Sandra respond.
Well, I think that too, realizing that you can't be your own kid's therapist. Mm-hmm. Because I definitely, when I had my first foster placement, I was like, I got this. I'm a BCBA and I'm a parent and I know how to be trauma informed now because I took all these classes and I got this and I did not got this. And, when a client isn't successful right away, sometimes that can be exciting because you can really not exciting that they're not successful, but you can really dig down and really get to the root of it and create a really effective life-changing intervention. But when it's your own kid, you are failing as a clinician and as a parent. And that is a lot of pressure to put on a little 2-year-old.
Right. Yes.
And I think that was really a hard lesson to learn, that I can't, be my kid's therapist. And also, I think though, being a parent also made me see the practicality of doing interventions. And I think that was a gift. And I think that having that background changed how I do things. And now I can train people in those ways. And now those people can train other people in those ways. But that's where my transition came from. Mm-hmm. I super yell at my kids sometimes. And then I feel bad about it because I know it's the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. But and so I can say to a parent, yo, it is fine if you give them a cookie when they're crying this time because you just needed to pee or you were gonna hit them. Cool. Give them the cookie. You're not gonna ruin the intervention.
Right.
Let's try again tomorrow. Mm. Whereas before I would have been if you give them that cookie, you are going to ruin everything and the interventions will never work because it is intermittent reinforcement and that is the hardest to get rid of. And the reality is this is not a science experiment. This is real life.
Right.
And if we're not going to give parents the tools, particularly parents who are trying to get out of a cycle of historical trauma, we're not going to see any change. Because a lot of the time when we talk about trauma-informed care, the focus is on foster care, or foster parents or adoptive parents, and we're ignoring the birth parents, the parents who are parenting these children.
Right. Yeah.
And, there are so many times I go into an intake and we ask every single parent, has a kid had involvement in the foster care system? Every single kid, doesn't matter who they are. You would be, I am still surprised by how many parents at the end of an intake say, oh yeah, they were in foster care when they were 2 for about a year. That they didn't come up any other time. The kid's 7 years old.
Yeah.
And they were in care, or they were in family preservation, or they were unhoused for a period of time. And it just doesn't come up. And a lot, in DC in particular, we really do have a relatively good social services system. And foster care really is about reunifying families. And so we parented kids and we reunified kids before we adopted. And the kids that we adopted just really couldn't go home. And they still see their parents and all of those things because that's best practices. But we need to be applying this and remembering that kids should be with their parents if it's possible. And those parents need these tools. It becomes a little bit more complicated with language, though, because you can't walk into a house and be like, you have traumatized your child. And now we need to do a setting event intervention so that your child isn't worried about that time that you beat them and didn't feed them, right? It has to be a much more gentler approach,
right?
But it's just super important.
Yeah. So Sandra, I'd like to let's talk a little bit about sort of what trauma is, what trauma isn't, because I'll be honest, up until maybe 18 months ago, if you asked me to define trauma, I'd be like, oh man, like a child was in a terrible exploding plane crash, or they were left alone in like a house with multiple dead bodies. And if it's anything else, it doesn't count. But those are traumatic events. That's a real problem. Everything else, especially here in America, you just got to get over it, grab yourself by your bootstraps and take a deep breath and you'll be fine. And you even already had mentioned, the idea of, the traumatic, event, trauma event. So what are some definitions that you found helpful in having those conversations or in bringing folks who are still kind of learning about trauma into a better understanding of what it is, what it isn't, its effect?
Yeah. So there are the official definitions of, traumatic events, right? So the Childhood Traumatic Stress Network defines those things that you're talking about, right, as traumatic events, right? The death of a loved one, domestic, abuse, those type of things, all the things you would expect, which, when I do my trainings, I list all of them and point out that 3 of them are things our kids and we experienced during COVID, right? Loss of loved ones, even if it's just from isolation, right? Fear of death, right? Like those things that are there, which ultimately, as a side note, was a side effect of COVID that I think really launched this accessibility of trauma-informed care in our field, because all of a sudden BCBAs were seeing the effects of trauma events.
Yes.
And also gave a platform to remote training. I've been doing these trainings for 7 years, but only at conferences or small events in DC. And all of a sudden I could get online and have an event, with 100 people. I presented at 3 conferences in 1 week. So that's the main definition there. The DSM-4 and the DSM-5, they changed the definition. So it used to be that you could feel helpless. And they took that out, which I think it's very controversial. So it has to be like you were actually in danger, not like you felt like you were, which I think there was a lot of controversy around kids in particular.
Yeah.
But when we talk about it behavior analytically, if you look at trauma as an event, right? So instead of saying like they were traumatized because they were abused, right? Well, that isn't behavior analytic. That doesn't mean anything, right? But you can say, they were hit and their leg was broken. Right? You can say they went 3 days without being fed.
Yeah.
They witnessed their mom in a car accident and, knocked unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so we can say those things and then we can talk about what happened as a result. Right? In an ABC. Right? So their mom was unconscious in a car accident. Right? And they yelled and screamed and somebody came and helped them. Right? And so there was, denied access to attention. They were, whatever you want to call that. They yelled and screamed and they got help. Well, you know what? They sure as heck got attention. And that now is going to be super powerful anytime they feel that they need help and they're unsafe. And now if they need help or they're unsafe and you're going to ignore their tantrum, it's so powerful at that point. Like, sure, you could break their will with a 6-hour tantrum while they're crying on the ground and create learned helplessness. But really, that was a really powerful skill that they developed that saved them, right? And so those are the kind of things that we're looking at when we're looking at these behavior chains, I think behavior analytically. Now, sometimes you don't know what happened.
Right.
And so sometimes it has to be a little bit more of a finesse. But, somebody, used the term universal trauma precautions. And so you can still create these interventions with that sort of in mind.
Sandra, you mentioned sort of kind of historically or in the recent history, why BCBAs suddenly, for lack of a better word, kind of care about trauma in a way that they had never before in the last, say, 2.5 years. Had you found before that when you would talk about some of these same concepts that there was sort of a resistance from others in our field? I know Rajaraman and colleagues bring up the idea of, they have some hypotheses they bring up as to why trauma was not something that kind of was as important, I think, for our field as a whole to talk about. But, the idea of, trauma's in the past and we only care about the immediate consequences, or there's so much language around trauma, it's not well defined, therefore there's not enough precision for our field to care about it. There's not enough data on evidence-based practice in trauma. I mean, were these patterns that you noticed firsthand, or was it really just something it was out of sight, out of mind for many of our, many practitioners?
I think that all of those concerns apply to a subset of BCBAs. And I think even I get hung up in trying to convince that group, even in my workshops, right? Like, I think we need to talk to those people. But I think for the most part, BCBAs, like there are a contingency of BCBAs who believe this and don't need to be convinced. Now, if you go into the ABA Facebook groups, right, it is disgusting what you see people saying, right? Like right after COVID happened, a mom posted, and she said, it was like 3 weeks after things shut down. And she said, my 3-year-old used to play by herself and now she won't. And I don't know what to do. She only wants to be with me. And if I leave her alone, she cries. All of the responses were about have her play for 15 seconds and reinforce her for playing alone. Not one person said, hug your baby.
Yeah.
Nobody. So I got on and I was like, do you want to hug your baby? Because whatever, if this was like destroying this mom's mental health, then maybe we needed to think about something different. And she was like, yeah, it's not bothering me, but she needs to go back to school and I don't want to regress her skills. And I was like, dude, the world has shut down and everyone is dying. Hug your baby.
Mm-hmm.
And like, we can teach these skills later. It's fine. Like, there is literally no problem with teaching your small child to cry when the world has ended because she wants her mom. That is aside from just like kind and human, that is age appropriate.
Yeah.
And so absolutely that is a thing in our field. But what I find is when I do these workshops, I get comments, I get emails, I get calls from people saying, I was going to leave the field. Thank you for giving me permission. I didn't know that
Permission to stay?
Yeah, permission to treat like this.
Okay. Yeah.
For telling me that it's, for showing me that, we can look at this behavior analytically. I did a workshop once and they sent me the responses and there was like 158 responses and 150 rated me as 4s and 5s. And they were like, changed my life, all these great things. 8 people gave me 1s.
Oh, wow.
And one guy wrote about how rude I was and that I was the rudest person he had ever heard give a workshop and he was never going to come back again. And obviously I wasn't rude because 150 people thought I was amazing. But I think it sort of talks to how, like, no matter what, right, these 8 people weren't there for it. But 150 people were.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, yes, those are the reasons, 100%, that people say, like, we can't do trauma or it doesn't matter. And all it cares is that you gave them attention for having the trauma, for the tantrum, or you gave them the cookie. But I don't think that's what the majority of the field is saying. I think that's what the gatekeepers are saying.
Mm.
And yeah. And then there are the BCBAs on Facebook who exist and are a problem. And I don't know where they are because they're not anybody who I talk to, but they're definitely there and they suck. But I do think that's where we're at.
I think also that the gatekeepers too, the older BCBAs and us, because I think we fit into your cohort, like the 10 to 20 year cohort of, sadly, we fit into yours and not the 2/3 of the new
Sadly.
But I think some of the gatekeepers too, some of those older behavior analysts are also recognizing this through COVID and through discussions with other fields. Now I think we're hopefully getting a little more interdisciplinary. And I know that some of our mentors, or at least Diana and mine, have really shifted in how they have thought about behavior analysis, even from when they were our instructors, right, back in 2003 to 2006 or so. And that's been like kind of, for me, it's been really exciting that, someone that's been in the field for so long can then be like, you know what, maybe I was wrong, and here's how I'm gonna like make steps, to be more empathetic and compassionate. I don't know. I find that exciting.
Yeah, and obviously not all veteran BCBAs are terrible, and there are some that have been doing this work without a name to it for this time as well. Dr. Golden has had a trauma-informed lean to her work. And so she has a BCBA. She's in that like very first cohort who like wasn't taking the
right.
exam. She was one of the first women, and so she practices more as a researcher, but her work has always leaned that way. And so there's certainly people to look towards, but I still think that, when we're talking about, our policies or how our ethics code is written, while it absolutely says we need to be, it can be applied to say we're trauma informed. it doesn't say it as clearly as it should.
All right, let's take a quick break before we continue to delve into this fascinating conversation on the applications of trauma-informed care. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
Hey everyone, before we continue back into the conversation with our special guest, Saundra Bishop, I want to remind everyone out there that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved, and by listening, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening to the episode and then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com/getceus, that's GET-CEUS, and find this episode. You can also find a link in the notes section of your podcast player. You're going to need 2 secret codes that we've hidden in the episode, though, before you can fill that form out. The first one is throw, 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 the act of hurling an object from one place to another, like a baseball or whatnot. Throw. All right, let's get back to our conversation with Saundra Bishop. So, Sandra, in terms of some of the work you had to do to develop kind of the framework, the workbook that you've put together, what were some of the fields and some of the the research that you were pulling from? Because I know for many of that, that 2/3 group, if you were to say you need to research trauma until a couple of years ago, you would have had to look outside of our JABAs and our BAPs and our behavioral interventions, which I know, especially when you just got out of grad school and you spent all this money and all this time talking precisely and only focusing on your 3-term contingency and, sort of being worried about using too many antecedent interventions, can be scary. That idea of I got to go outside of my field. And when do I know that it's no longer ABA and it's just some sort of, quack doctor or psychologist is just talking about, I got to hug your kids more. And when is it meaningful science? And when is it just someone's weird idea, the social media post equivalent of maybe like a psychological intervention. So I'd love to hear more about sort of where you first were learning about trauma, sort of what work sort of inspired you to put all of this work together.
And it's interesting because even in obviously the field of psychology has been doing trauma work for a long time, but even there, it's still young. Mm-hmm. And so really my first deep education was as a foster parent. Again, DC has been on the cutting edge, 10, 11 years ago when I became a foster parent. We were one of the first states, even though we're not a state, but that's another podcast, to be doing trauma-informed systems training for foster parents. And so we were doing, 20 hours of classes, plus for training. So that's really where I gained my foundations there. And so then I knew it there and continued to do research. As I was working on these materials, though, from a clinical background, right? So I had that basic knowledge there. Is, really talking about, and I studied the psychology components in college and things like that, but was looking at things from the measurable components in the research-based things. So like the CDC has a really, which is one of the articles we have. It's amazing. And I think it's really useful for BCBAs to look at because it has real numbers. And it talks about, it uses the ACEs assessment. And the thing about the ACEs, which assesses your childhood trauma, and it's events, right? So you had it is a 1, you didn't have it, it's a 0. And it's a standardized assessment. Anybody can give it. It's super imperfect. Like it asks, like, did your dad hit your mom? So it doesn't account for the fact that women can be abusers or same gender couples or any of that. But nonetheless, it's a standardized assessment. And this project shows the long-term outcomes and the multi-generational outcomes, but the long-term outcomes of having a high ACE score, which includes things that you would, that we talk about, right? Which is, things you would expect, like more likely to have broken bones and poor school and more likely to be depressed, but also like you're more likely to have cancer and, high blood pressure. And like, so things that, I'm sure if you like run through the chain, you can figure out why. And so being able to have those hard numbers, I think is super valuable. And then I also think the like being able to see the neurological impacts of trauma, because it like actually changes your brain development, I think is another piece that's was very useful for me when I learned about that. Because it's not about like feelings, right? It's about like, here's your brain and it lights up differently and it does these different things. And also like your physiological reactions to trauma triggers. There's all sorts of really cool studies about mice and cat hairs and how they're rats and cat hairs. And like you have like a cat like terrorize a rat. And then if you just put like one cat hair in their like cage, how they'll have that, like their brain will light up and they'll do all these like these trauma responses to the like cat hair. It's super fascinating. So anyway, yeah. So like those are things that like are very data based. And then also when I was looking at, so in the handbook, I talk about a lot of different types of like setting event interventions, which include for the trauma events and just general, which include things like calming the like anxiety, quote unquote, which are essentially these physiological responses or the repeated negative self-talk. And those are based more in psychology. So like mindfulness, right? Which is going to be like saying positive things or deep breathing. And so in that case, looking at the research on that stuff done within those industries. So that's my really long answer because it's great, but we don't do the research on it and we should.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that as behavior analysts, we're continue to be afraid of thinking about stimuli that are occurring inside the body, as well as long-term reinforcing events and setting events in our own histories. And we shouldn't be, because behavior can occur inside the skin, and many stimuli that we respond to are occurring inside the skin as well. And there is a way that we can frame this discussion within the terminology that we use as behavior analysts. It just requires us to, think in a bigger, broader way. And we, maybe got here as a field by thinking about and defining things really systematically and focusing so much on contiguous causation and current events. But that's not to say that something that happened a long time ago can't still produce or be tied to current setting events, right? So like your description of the cat hair, I think is a perfect analogy. So something that happened a long time ago, just because it was long ago, doesn't mean that you don't remember it, or there aren't current antecedents that may function as aversive stimuli because they are similar to that event in the past, even if what's happening right now may not actually be as traumatic or as, I guess, dangerous, right? But it's still going to produce the same type of response due to your own personal history. And because we're individuals, you'd think that behavior analysts, everything we do is individualized, right? So recognizing that there's differences in each of our reinforcement histories and our learning histories, that's just as relevant and important as what we're going to plan for someone in the future, right? We're all coming into this with our own personal histories, but we don't always ask about it or learn about it. And that's, I think, missing in our field.
But I think, though, we do look at past things, right? Like if you're talking about, like, when we talk about extinction, right? If you want to do like a traditional extinction procedure, we all know that after an extinction process, sometimes they'll try it again, right? And that's based off of past learning history. And it could be, 3 years from now, you're going to try a cigarette again. Or 3 years from now, I might try hitting you for a cookie, right? And we all know then, and if you give in, then everything's going to go back to the way it was, which is why you never give in, right? Mm-hmm. And so, we are aware of that. We do look at medical history as a setting event, right? We know if somebody has a migraine, or a seizure, right? Let's do a seizure, super obvious, right? If someone is having a seizure, right? We know that no matter how many times we tell them to clap their hands, they're not going to clap their hands. In the same way, if somebody is having a panic attack, they're not going to be able to clap their hands, which clapping your hands is a dumb goal, but nonetheless.
Calm down. You tell them to calm down all you like. Right. Those very effective SD of calm down that we all respond just like that to.
But I mean, and I think that that's the way to look at it, right? Is that, so if I'm, one of the examples I use, right, is the kid with the cookie, right? So you see a cookie, jump up and down and scream, and his mom gives him a cookie, right? Very clear. Don't give him the cookie.
Right.
If we know that if he skipped breakfast, right, classic setting event, he is more likely to jump up and down when he sees a cookie. So you know what? Let's do let's do 2 antecedent interventions here. Let's put the cookies away, so he's less likely to jump up and down when he sees cookies. And then we can work on requesting cookies and all of that stuff, right? Because can't hide cookies forever. But why would we just put cookies out if he can't have them? That's mean. If we know that he has tantrums when he sees them, right? Also, let's make sure he has breakfast. If he just has breakfast, we can potentially just stop the tantrum behavior, the jumping up and down and screaming, if he's not hungry, right? We all know that. We skip that in our intervention plans for whatever reason. We throw everything at the wall, maybe. We're like, make sure the environment's clear and stands within arm distance and all that, even if that has nothing to do with anything. But we're not looking at it. So, right? So we've done those 2 things. If we also know that he has early food deprivation, well, then we need to deal with that. Because now, no matter what, if I don't give him the food when he jumps up and down and screams, jumping up and down and scream to getting food is so powerful that if I deny him access to the food, it's just going to increase that. And I use the word anxiety when I talk about it. And I talk about that I use these words for power and whatever. I can operationally define it, right? Increased heart rate, negative thoughts, blah, blah, blah. So instead, we want to do a setting event to address that anxiety. So I'm going to give him a food chart. I'm going to tell him when his next meals are. It's not a food diet, right? But it's just hey, these are when our meals are, these are when our snacks are. Yeah. And I'm going to give him access to anytime food. So I'm going to put out a food he'll eat that's maybe healthy or whatever. So like carrots. And so now I've addressed this issue of his food deprivation concerns. And probably now we're not going to, potentially, we're going to help avoid this behavior chain because we're also going to feed him breakfast. We're also going to keep the cookies away while we work on teaching him how to say cookie. And also we should do replacement behaviors to also teach him to eat breakfast himself and to go and look at his chart and go and eat the anytime food. So he's accessing all of that independently. Mm. And then there's also consequence interventions that are kind and nice and all of that. But it's all within are chains. And I think that's what's so cool about this model. And, obviously things don't always come in this big package and an easy bow. But a lot of the times, if you really think about it, you can narrow it down.
Mm-hmm.
At least well enough to create an intervention.
Mm-hmm. So Sandra, one of the things I loved about the workbook, and I did see one of your workshops that you did for Babbitt, back in the spring. So is reading through all of the concepts that we're talking about here make perfect sense. Oh, of course that's a setting event. Of course that's a trauma event setting event. Of course that's the replacement behavior. But with any new skill, when you're reading the examples, there's always that terrible fear in the back of your mind. But what if it's not exactly the same as the 3 examples in this book? How will I identify these trauma event setting events? Like what as a practitioner can I do? Because if it's not cookie related, what's the other example? I think it's cleaning the room. They had a parent, the child had a parent. Yes.
Yeah.
When it's not one of those, what do I do? So are there, suggestions you have for folks who are trying to be mindful of the TESIs in this situation, but they really haven't seen that many, outside of your workshop?
Yeah. So like the interventions over like this. Yes. So actually somebody recommended that, like to have a bank of things. Mm-hmm. And so I'm actually working on that because usually in the workshops, we do it live. And so people are able to sort of brainstorm an intervention and I sort of talk through it. But yes, I am working on a bank that I'm going to include with recommendations and ideas. A lot of it is our creativity though. Like, well, what would you do? And there are a bunch of ideas in the workbook, but yes, I am working on a bank for that to address that. A lot of it, I just, a lot of it is the same way that you would address, is looking at like, what is the function? Mm. Right? Okay. He is worried he's not going to eat, right? The function is it's not thinking about, okay, so what is the trauma history, right? Which is not somewhat related to the function, but not a little bit separate. So the trauma history is he didn't eat. So how can we alleviate that concern, right? And so, somebody who's experienced domestic violence, right? So this is the concern right now. This is affecting the behavior chain. So for our TESI, for our trauma event setting event intervention, then you're going to think about, well, how can I alleviate this concern that there will be domestic violence in this house? So then, okay, what if we have a behavior contract that the adults do not hit each other? And we have a big sign. Those ones, it's really important that you only say the adults because kids might hit each other. Right. So you want to make sure it's honest. Yeah. You might have a rule or an agreement that kids shouldn't hit each other, but that's different than your posted contract to address this, right? You have a meeting to address concern or whatever it is that's going to be there. But at that point, you're going to need to know your kid, right? There's been a car crash. So what are you going to do to address that concern? What is it that the kid is going to be worried about, right? Well, is it, okay, so we're going to talk about or have a social story about today we're wearing our seatbelt. We're going to drive this way. Or is it, I'm going to call you when I get to my location. Mm-hmm. And so it's going to be a component of sleuthing based off of what the kid's anxiety is. And if the kid doesn't talk, again, and it's all about our hypothesis testing, just like with any intervention, right? We always guess. If, we do our data collection and there's a little bit of, here our data ... isn't going to be ... It's going to be interviewing the family. And then we'll be able to take our dots. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think you explained it very nicely in terms of that. I like sleuthing. I think we should use that term more. I like that a lot. That idea of, what are we looking at, in terms of where do we see things that could go into our traditional ABC, but also what is the trauma event and how can we sort of speak to that in terms of our planning. And some of it is just going to be, let's add some of these components in. And if we see less of some of the signs of those antecedents occurring, then all right, that we probably picked out some good ones. If we're seeing the exact same pattern, all right, what could we add to our treatment that before the behavior of note begins to occur, before we start seeing emotional responding.
And what's important, though, is that we're not having one of those things being processing the feelings, because that is outside our scope.
Yeah, okay.
And that becomes, I have to really be on my RBTs about that, because then they're like, oh, he told me about, and I'm like, nope.
Right.
That's not what we do. Have him write it down to talk to his therapist.
Yeah.
Or bring mom in. Call mom in right now if he wants to talk about his feelings, and have her talk about that. But that is outside our scope. We are not trained to do that. And so we can't be doing these interventions without them having a therapist. If the kid doesn't have access to a therapist, then there has to be somebody. There can be the school social worker. They've got to, somebody has to be involved on the clinical side to be able to manage that. Just like you wouldn't manage the diabetes.
Yeah.
You can train a kid or teach a kid to use their pump and check their levels, right? We do that behavior analytically, but we're not going to manage the medical side of it. So it's just super important.
Yeah.
Sure.
I love the part in these articles that talked about, first and foremost, you have to establish a basis of safety. So the child needs to feel safe in the current environment. And I think a lot of the antecedent arrangements that we're discussing are getting toward that, right? So the idea of having the contract in the house, and we could take that and say, this is an additional, environmental indicator or discriminative stimulus that this is going to be a safe environment such that your needs are going to be met. Adults are going to behave predictably here, and there's going to be, a standard set of outcomes that you can expect based on your behavior. So the more of those that are present in that setting event, as well as addressing needs like making sure kids eat breakfast, then the more we're then going to be able to move forward and teach the additional skills that are needed.
Yeah, 100%. And the thing is that with the trauma stuff, you want to be as consistent as possible because it's such a high stress, but also apologies work because everybody is a person, and modeling repairs has value. And also people are people. And so we really have to get away from expecting parents to be perfect. Now, as a provider, we need to do it perfectly. We can make, do a slight error in an intervention, but we need to not ever yell at a kid, right? That would be absolutely inappropriate. And that's what I tell families. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to look like I'm magic, but I don't have to go take a shower and cook dinner and parent my other kids right now.
Right.
I can do it for 30 minutes. Longer than that, we'll see how good my procedural integrity stays. But
yeah, but that we need to do something reasonable. So my kids came in clusters. And so I went from 2 kids to 4. My third daughter came, and then a month later, my fourth daughter came.
Yeah.
And we were just in crisis. It was just, I went from having a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old to a 1, 2, 4, and 5-year-old.
Wow.
All of a sudden.
It was 100% increase in children.
Oh my gosh. It was a lot. It was really hard. And the 1-year-old could barely walk, and she didn't have language, and all she did was tantrum and throw herself on the ground. And the 5-year-old was just like a tornado. And my 2-year-old is as amazing then as she is now. And so we had a BCBA come, and this woman says, you got to take data. And all right, got this. BCB, I'm going to take my data. I have my little clipboard. And then one day I'm standing there and I've got my hands in the hair of the 1-year-old. and I've got my leg up on a chair in between the table and where I am, the counter where I'm doing her hair, as the 2-year-old and the 5-year-old are like cat fighting over each other.
Gosh.
And my 5-year-old, my biological 5-year-old, is crying because I didn't feed her breakfast and it's lunchtime.
Oh, no.
And I was just like, I can't take any data.
Right.
And so I went to the BCBA and I was like, I can't do this. I can't take data.
Yeah.
And she goes, well, I have 4 kids and I was able to take data.
Whoa.
Oh.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, you
felt validated, I'm sure, right?
Yeah. I was like, you seem kind of young. How old were your kids at the time? She goes, yeah, they were my stepkids, and the youngest was 10 and the oldest was 16.
Oh.
I literally walked away and was like, I will like never talk to this woman again. I have no idea what this woman's name is. If I saw her on the street, I would like never recognize her. This was like, what, 6 years ago? But I wish her no ill will because I don't even know who she is. I hope she learned from that experience. But it made me such a better provider, even if it just like devastated me in the moment of like, I didn't feel bad because I knew she was in the wrong, but like, it just made me realize at that point how real and like flexible you have to be with parents.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, Sandra, I love that as kind of an example of working with families. Are there other things that when you're looking at kind of trauma-informed care, because I would see those cases, while a trauma event can happen to anybody, most of the time I would assume, especially for a lot of our listeners, if you are being told like, hi, you're coming in and you're working with this child with a severe trauma history, you're probably working with lots of people. You're going to be working with the family, certainly, possibly siblings, other providers, a therapist, the school social worker. Are there any other either red flags or suggestions you have for providers on being on a team that might have so many people? Like, are there terms that are charged that you've seen? Like, you try to talk about something in terms of reinforcement and a psychologist said, whoa, that's not fair to bring up in terms of a trauma history. That's a hypothetical. I have no idea if that's one of them. But are there sort of any areas, either tips or red flags when you're working with these big teams that can include, certainly the family and all these other providers in sharing this model or in working along with this model?
Oh, that's a really good question. Nobody's asked me that before. And I have like, my brain's going like in 17 different directions because I like want to say all the things. I think I would break it into 2 ways. I would say I would break it into people who think ABA is magic and people who hate ABA. And so for people who think ABA is terrible, right, for lots of good reasons, who really think that ABA is going to drill and kill kids at the table and do, extinction and have kids lay on the ground and cry, which a lot of us are going to do, even when we think we don't, right? If you're going to say, I'm going to give a kid a break, but they have to comply first. Or if you're going to say, oh, but I don't do punishment, but mom can't come in the room because they're having a tantrum and I don't want to reinforce the tantrum, right? That is still doing extinction. Mm. And so, and yes, I know extinction is when you stop a behavior, but everybody knows what I mean. And it's annoying when like people will be like, excuse me. It's just like, y'all, you know what I'm talking about. And so being able to get ahead of that in those meetings is really helpful to be like, hey, I know that ABA doesn't traditionally, ABA isn't typically associated with trauma-informed care. I want to let you know that we are addressing the trauma piece of it by looking at it, how it affects the rest of the behavior. And so we've got our eye on that, and just getting that out there at the beginning is super helpful. And it's just like everybody kind of gives like a sigh of relief. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. For people who think ABA is magic, what I see happen a lot is they just say everything's behavior. Mm-hmm. So you have a kid who's displaying sexualized aggression and perhaps is less vocal than the providers used to. Oh, it's behavior. Mm-hmm. And it's like, okay, well, there are certain things that, a certain level of behavior we're able to manage. But at some point, it becomes psychiatric. Mm. right? Or it becomes psychologically clinical, right? And so sexually reactive behavior is not behavior analytical often, right? We need to deal with that component on the psychology side. And so we get some pushback there. And so really having to stand our ethical boundaries there is the other piece. And sometimes that means discharging care. Often, almost every time I present, I'll have somebody come to me with a case that's like the person is putting their head through windows and they're so aggressive, and they'll be like, so, with the Tessie, and it's just like, you know what, that really seems like it's outside the scope, and that those behaviors are so significant that that needs to be a psychiatric case. Because at some point, you can put as many posters up on the wall, and you do need a higher level of care.
That's a great point, Sandra. And when it comes to BCBAs who are new to trauma-informed care, do you have any suggestions for getting to a level of competence in that care? Because I know I've worked with some BCBAs who said, I'm trauma-informed. And I asked them, what does that mean? And they're like, I saw a talk. They give you that answer. Like, well, I've seen a lot of talks too. I read a lot of papers. But I don't go around being like, don't worry, everyone, out of the way. I got a podcast and we did an episode on this, so I'm ready to go.
Your card-carrying member.
Yeah. This is back when no one had a podcast. Not everyone had their own podcast. So it really meant,
I emailed y'all and was like, hey, I'd love to be on your podcast. And I don't even know who I was emailing back. Somebody was like, oh, okay. Jackie sent me a response back and was like, oh, okay, great. Can you send me some references? And I said, oh, okay, cool. Do you want like somebody I presented with, or just somebody to tell you how fun and adorable I am? And she was like, I'm sure you're fun and adorable, but I meant like an article.
That actually made my day.
Yes.
I was like, I actually would love those references if you could like send me all the ways that people love you. That was a really funny email, and I love it.
Yeah, that'll be our new guest criteria. Like, you need to have at least two people send an amusing anecdote about you, or you can't be on our show.
But as far as like being able to be trauma informed as a BCBA, it's really difficult because we don't have a standard of care right now. And really, honestly, so much of where I got my information ultimately started as a foster parent, right? I was so well trained as a foster parent that that's so much of where my foundational knowledge came from. I'm a certified trauma professional through Evergreen. And, that's a great program. It's not necessarily going to give competency if you don't have, significant background already, though it's a really great place to start. Dr. Cammilleri Kulu has her training that she has. I have webinars and CEUs on my website, the Basics ABA Therapy. And also the handbook has information. Dr. Hanley has his programs, which he doesn't bill it as being trauma informed, but it's kind and gentle. And so, but at this point, there isn't like a certification or anything for BCBAs. And so I really recommend going to like adoption conferences. Like that's a really good place to go, because you can get, and unfortunately they don't apply for CEUs for us anymore, which is really sad. When they let us cross-reference, like cross CEUs, that was so great for the field, for us to be able to use CEUs from other fields. Like, I just feel like that was so great for us, but nonetheless. But unfortunately, it doesn't count for CEUs for us, but to be able to go and be up on the research on trauma-informed care in those arenas is really great. So I would love to develop a certification. It is one of my future goals, but yeah.
So to some extent it is going to be, and I guess that kind of goes into the definition of competence. A lot of it is sort of, do you think you can do this, individual practitioner? But it'll be kind of a mix of things, attend some workshops, read some papers, there's always find a mentor. And it does seem like there are more practitioners that have experience who either through your own, sort of your personal experience leading into the professional experience, or whether it's just become a part of the research of their clinic or their programming. You have more resources than you would have had 5 years ago, let's say, even in our field of finding a mentor. And then starting there, and probably you might be working on a multidisciplinary team. So I'd hope some of those folks are sort of in between the magic and the I hate ABA stance that might want to help you out a little.
Yes. And the BCABA says that you should always have, a mentor to give you clinical guidance if you don't have experience in an area of competency.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. So hopefully there's more than 2 other BCBAs, or you might need to look outside the field a little bit at this kind of, or these early stages of it being part of, behavior analysis as a whole. Sandra, are there any other parts of your framework that we haven't covered? I know we spent a lot of time talking about the antecedent components and TESEs, and that really, I think, is a huge chunk, like a lot of the meat of how you're reconceptualizing kind of the traditional ABC format. We didn't talk too much about, I think, the basics strategies in terms of kind of looking at, what's kind of not exactly a blanket kind of consequent plan, but some components that you could think about when you are moving into the consequent component of the plan, or you are starting to look at the skill development that eventually needs to be a part of the overall treatment package. But are there any other components like that you feel, you'd like to bring up now, or you think we could talk about in our conversation?
The consequence interventions, I think, are super important because there's the 2 tiers, right? So you still can't give the kid a cookie for throwing the shoe at you, right? That's still, there has to be something that happens in between, right? But that doesn't mean that nothing can happen, right? And I think we get stuck in that even if we're saying like, oh, it's not for attention, we're like, but we don't want to teach that it's for attention. So we still have to just keep, ignoring them until they stop tantruming. And then once they stop tantruming, then they can, ask for the cookie or whatever. So it came up with a series of potential responses to a behavior while they're engaging in it. And the acronym is BASICS because I'm very clever because my company is BASICS.
Talk about synergy. Nice work.
It's so good. But basically it's 6 different ways to intervene. And the goal of it is de-escalation and setting kids up for success. They're based off of those 2 things versus the function. And the idea being is if those are done well, the behavior is going to decrease over time because they're going to see how to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
And so the examples are, so like B is for break. So kids should have unlimited access to breaks. So even if a kid engages in an ineffective behavior the first time, they can still get access to a break without having to comply first. We have found that kids being able to have full access to breaks, they could sit on a break the entire 3 hours if they want to, and they don't. And if they do, they end up being sick or something is wrong. Or our session sucks and there's something wrong with us and we need to fix it. Right. And that if we had made this kid work with us and then it turned out they had the flu, first off, our staff would have gotten the flu because they would have been up in their face with a screaming kid. But also that's not nice. And that's sad. Right. And so, so unlimited breaks. And so allowing the kid the out, because again, we tell parents, well, if they're crying anyway, they're already not doing the task.
Yeah.
And so just let them say, no, thank you. A is always reinforce. So reinforce small components, or if they engage in the behavior, that the replacement behavior will reinforce it. That'll depend on the student, right? If you have a student who it can very successfully do the behavior and then they punch you and then they're can I have the cookie, right? That's going to depend on the skill set. But if you have a kid who's never said cookie before and they punch you and then they say cookie, right? We're going to, but that's ABA. And so then it goes through those type of things. S is silliness. And so sometimes you can do something goofy. I had one student, he had a direction to sit. And I wouldn't have that direction again, but it was early on in my career and he just wouldn't. And so I gave him an invisible chair and he sat in the invisible chair. Some kids, with my 8-year-old, if I did silly with her, she would be so mad at me.
Right.
Like she would just be so angry. Oh, and then as I wonder statements. I know I'm like skipping around, but I'm just getting the ones I like the best. I wonder is my favorite because you can talk to the student without making them talk back.
Yeah.
And say, like, I wonder if you want the cookie, because you could say cookie. Right. And so now I'm not like directly prompting. I'm not giving a direction. I'm just talking to the universe. I wonder if Johnny is nervous about dinner.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if Johnny wants to look at his food chart.
Yeah.
And then there's no like pressure there. And a lot of times they'll be like, I don't want to look at my chart. I just hate you. And then you're like, oh, okay. Thanks
right.
for me.
I was just wondering.
Thanks for letting me know.
And then sometimes the conversation starts. And so anyway, so you do all of those. Yeah. And a lot of times that'll just de-escalate the behavior. And then you can move on to what it is you're trying to do. Because if you just get stuck in the battle of wills or only trying to prompt up that replacement behavior, if you're trying to do an even better intervention, right? If you're not trying to battle of wills, you are trying to give the kid out, you're still running into this like clash. Now, you're not going to do, all 6 aren't going to be right for every student, right? Like I said, and you're not going to like run through all 6.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Like, even if they're all good for the same kid, you're not going to be like, I'm going to try this one, this one, this one, this one. But they're all available there.
Mm-hmm. I'm increasingly of the mindset, Sandra, that having kind of those blanket with basics or what, having those sort of as a component or as sort of an overarching set of not exactly principles, but they kind of get at a lot of, some of the function of behavior, antecedent strategy. Well, yes, antecedent strategies, consequence strategies, however you're using them in the context, as really kind of an important skill that I don't know how much newer BCPAs are trained to do that. Like, I know I've learned to do that over, 15 plus years of doing this, because I think, especially when I was young, so I'll just speak to my own experience. It was like, well, I have this plan and I have to do this as my antecedent strategy and I have to do this as my consequence strategy. And if I don't do these things exactly, 20 years from now, when my client is, going to their court mandated therapy, they're going to look back and say, oh, this guy, Rob Perry, he gave me the cookie that one time. And my life has spiraled out of control. That, behavior is complex. Human behavior is so complex that I'm not going to be the one person that jumped in and did, something other than the 2 things my behavior plan said that led to the downfall of an individual. That's not how it's going to develop. And when I sort of relieve myself of that own pressure of like, no, I have to be the one to save the day with these 2 steps that I wrote down based on the results of my one assessment I did, it's very liberating and allows you to be thinking, allows you to actually allow, a trauma-informed approach into your overall procedure and your mindset. And it gives you those the freedom to be mindful and to think maybe this is a good time for an I wonder statement, even though that wasn't the prompt that I wrote down as a part of my elaborate teaching procedure. So I do love having that on hand, and I appreciate you putting it in an easy to remember acronym as well.
Well, and the thing about it too is that with a lot of this concept, particularly for newer clinicians, is there tends to be a throw everything at the wall approach. Mm-hmm. And the thing that I like about it being the acronym is it's like, oh, okay, these are the like 6 things I can do. And then you can break them down into smaller pieces, but it's not like, okay, I have to de-escalate them. That's what trauma is.
Right.
So I'm going to ask them how they feel and if they want to break and if everything is fine. And it's just like, and especially for the clinicians, it's like, okay, I'm going to wonder and I'm going to do these. These are my 3 choices. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I also run into the other issue that I see happening, particularly with new clinicians, but also clinicians who are feeling guilty about doing it, like harm, potentially causing harm in the past, is that they're swinging so far over that they're not creating safe interventions. And so like you'll see every once in a while somebody say, okay, so this child really needs to chew on things. And so I'm really trying to not, implement punishment procedures. I'm trying to meet their needs. But when they put their hands on my mouth, on my arm, their mouth on my arm during the sessions, they're starting to break skin with their teeth. And it's like, okay, well, no, that doesn't mean that you have to let them like suck on your arm during the session.
Yeah.
That's not appropriate or effective. And you have body autonomy. Nobody has to even if their sensory desire is to suck on your arm, you don't have to allow that. And we want to be teaching affirmative consent to our students and modeling that for them. And so that being trauma informed doesn't mean letting people do whatever they want because it feels good to them. We can still say no.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think that that's an important piece too.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've covered a lot of components that can go into trauma-informed care. And since I don't think we're going to get it done in the time we have to talk about every possible permutation of it, let's move into our dissemination station and kind of come up with some summary statements for practitioners and for listeners. Oh, we're here. How nice. All right. So Sandra, sometimes we just talk about the summary. I think since trauma-informed care in some ways is quote unquote new in ABA, I'd like to start with where you see trauma-informed care in our field going over the next 1 to 5 years. What's still left to know or to do? I know you talked about some ideas that you had that you'd like to implement to sort of make it easier to, get this content and to make it a part of every practitioner's. Trying to think of a good word. I always want to go to bag of tricks, but I hate saying bag of tricks. I hate saying toolbox too.
Tool belt.
Repertoire.
Like a
repertoire.
Batman.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
In their treatment development repertoire. That sounds better. Yes. So can we start there? Kind of what's next for trauma-informed practice in ABA?
Yeah. I think I would like to see a standard of practice. We see it in, ACT. We see it in PFA.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. They change those every now and again too, which makes it harder.
There's a standard of, practice in those models. And so, instead of it being this weird word that can mean lots of things, I would love to see a standard in practice for that. So that's something. But I guess before that would be, recognition from our organizations that we need to be doing this. All of the other psychology fields are saying that trauma-informed care is important. The AAP is saying that, all organizations that work with children are saying that, and we should be doing that as well.
Mm-hmm. Just to piggyback on that, I would love a better acronym than I like trauma-informed care as a phrase, but then I think in D2's article, it's written a lot way, TIC is important. I want us to come up with a better acronym. Maybe we could come up with a better way to package trauma-informed care that isn't TIC, because that just makes me think of a blood-sucking insect that will give me Lyme disease.
So Dr. Kulu calls it TIBA.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that sounds better.
Trauma-informed behavior analysis.
Okay, yes. All right, let's start. I'm going to start. That's my next step. I'm going to start using TIBA instead of just saying the whole trauma-informed care or TIC.
But I think that Dr. Hanley specifically doesn't do that because he doesn't want to call it behaviorism, because he is allergic to the word behaviorism. So I think that that's the logic there.
Oh, we'll just say TIBA because it sounds better. And then
it does, right?
We'll figure out the acronym. We can figure out the acronym later, I guess. As long as we're all kind of doing similar actions. For listeners, for practitioners who are saying trauma-informed care, all right, I'm in. I want to do it. I want to be a part of it. Where would you say the best place to start would be?
You should go to my website and watch my webinars. Mine are great, and buy my handbook, which is Basics ABA Therapy. But I think that, I already talked about Dr. Kulu at Cusp Emergence. She has some webinars, and she also has something called the safety assessment that is an assessment tool. And, Dr. Hanley's work is well respected. Also, the ACT models are really cool. I am still trying to become more of a competent in it. I think it's really neat. It's been hard for me to wrap it around really getting it into my practice.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's a really great model that can apply.
Great. And again, Saundra, if folks want to, after they, of course, listen to the great podcast at ABA Inside Track, they want to go to a second website. What could you say your contact information again?
Okay, so it's basicsabatherapy.com. And then people can always email me at Saundra@basicsaba.com. I love BCBA friends. I respond really slowly to emails, though. I see them, but I'm working on it right now. Also, people can LinkedIn me, but I'm still learning how to use LinkedIn. So I don't really know how to do it, but I'm trying. I need to learn how to do it.
It's okay. I lost my password like 2 years ago, so I don't know what's going on over there.
I don't understand what you're supposed to post.
For anyone who's trying to LinkedIn me.
I don't understand what kind of things are okay to post there or not. Like, what's professional anymore or not? Can I put my name? I don't know.
It's very, I feel like old man yells at cloud when it comes to social media of like, no, thank you. No, I don't want any young people. I'm going to go over here. I'll Xerox my zine perhaps, but I'm not going to engage with this internet. No,
Facebook is where I am the most. And so I'm Saundra Bishop, BCBA on Facebook.
Well, be careful what you post, because then you might talk about how you don't like them, some of their posts, as you're mentioning. Some folks on Facebook not always jump into some good conclusions.
Oh, no. So those are like the closed groups. So you're not allowed to like talk about the individual posts.
Oh, okay.
Because it's like secret. I don't know. I might even get in trouble for vaguely talking about it, but I think it's okay.
If you do, I'll never know, because I'm not on there. I'm too busy yelling about my rocking chair or whatever I'm doing over here.
And they're closed in the sense that someone has to, grant you access to the groups. But then once you're in those groups, there are thousands of people in there. So if anyone is in those groups, you should not be posting clinical advice to others on the internet.
Oh, yeah. We've done plenty of episodes about that.
I will never step down from this soapbox.
Absolutely not.
All right. Sandra, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us about your work and sharing so much from your workbook and the research you've done so that we can continue our own journeys to talk about and learn about trauma-informed care. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was really fun.
Big thanks one more time to Saundra Bishop for joining us today to talk all about applications of trauma-informed care, going through so much of the workbook that she has spent so much of her professional career putting together and gathering all that information. So it was really, really great to have her on firsthand to talk more in depth about all that we've been able to read. We hope you enjoyed that time as well. I also want to thank my co-hosts, Jackie and Diana, and thank you, the listener, for listening to ABA Inside Track. Please feel free to leave us a review and subscribe if you want to hear even more on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you like to get your podcasts. You can go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to find links to all of the articles that we discussed, as well as to find all of our back catalog and a place to purchase CEs. You can do that, get CEs for almost all of our episodes. And speaking of which, you probably want that second secret code word. And again, these are special guest code words from our special guest, Saundra. And the second code word is SHOE, SHOE. It's the thing you put on your foot. Now, many of you astute listeners probably know where our code words came from. Again, our second one right now, SHOE. If you enjoy ABA Inside Track and would like to hear even more content and get discounts for CEs, you can subscribe for even more on patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. For $5 a month, you gain access to our live recording episodes. You get a chance to vote on topics that we will discuss once per season, as well as discounts on our CE store. If you want even longer episodes of ABA Inside Track, we do a quarterly book club that's available for our $10 and up patrons. We just recently recorded our episode on street data, a discussion of a more socially valid way to gather data on student performance as a way to build equity in our public schools and as a way for us to be thinking about how we can continue to build equity in our own field. If you want access to that plus 2 CEs for no additional purchase, go to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track to subscribe and to get access to all of the previous book clubs that we've done. We've done tons of episodes on things like behavioral economics, memoirs, and even far back as our meaningful differences discussion. Again, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. And you can always email us at abainsidetrack@gmail.com. Some final big thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabin of the Podcast Doctors for his fabulous editing work. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye!